The office was still cloaked in silence, the kind that only exists before sunrise in a city that never truly sleeps. David Langston, CEO of Virion Tech, was the kind of man who arrived before the world stirred. He liked the quiet, no calls, no meetings, just his thoughts and the soft hum of the building coming to life. The marble floors gleamed under the lobby lights, recently polished, and the scent of cleaning solution still lingered faintly in the air. He walked with purpose, Starbucks in hand, past the security desk and toward the elevator, when something stopped him. A voice, smooth, lyrical, unmistakably fluent, spoke French with the ease of a native speaker. David glanced toward the sound. It was coming from the hallway just off the lobby, near the janitorial supply closet. He turned the corner slowly, careful not to interrupt. There, leaning slightly against his mop, was Jorge, the night janitor. He was cradling a small phone between shoulder and ear, speaking softly, his words rolling with grace. David watched, unseen for a moment, as Jorge laughed gently, saying something that sounded like a fond farewell. Then, with fluid ease, Jorge switched languages. It wasn't French anymore. It was Mandarin. David blinked. He'd taken 3 months of Mandarin in college before switching majors. He recognized a few words, greetings, questions, something about family. Jorge's tone shifted naturally, the cadence of his speech suggesting deep comfort and fluency. When the call ended, Jorge turned and jumped slightly when he saw David standing there. "Mr. Langston," he said, straightening. "Sorry, I didn't know anyone was here yet." David smiled, disarmed by the moment. "No need to apologize. That was, quite impressive." Jorge looked confused for a second, then followed David's gaze to the phone still in his hand. "Oh, that? Just talking to my cousin in Montreal. And then a colleague in Beijing." "Colleague?" David asked, intrigued. "Well, old colleague," Jorge corrected, wiping his hands on a rag. "Back home I was a linguistics professor. Taught at the university for nearly 12 years. My cousin and I still stay in touch. We exchange papers. She's working on a book about disappearing dialects." David stared at him, momentarily at a loss for words. Jorge, who for the past 5 years had silently swept the halls, emptied trash cans, and scrubbed bathrooms, was a scholar. A polyglot. And he'd never once mentioned it. "You speak, how many languages?" David asked. 9, Jorge said, almost shyly. "Fluently. I can get by in a few more. But I haven't used them much lately." David ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. Jorge looked down, as if embarrassed. "It's not something I talk about. Most people don't ask. Besides, I came here with nothing. My credentials didn't transfer. I had a kid to feed. Work is work, right?" David nodded slowly, the full weight of the moment settling in his chest. Something about the way Jorge stood, humble, unassuming, made David feel like he was standing in front of someone profoundly out of place, not by choice, but by circumstance. Later that morning, the office buzzed with its usual rhythm, keyboards clacking, voices on calls, footsteps echoing against the polished floor. But David Langston's mind was far from the quarterly sales meeting he was supposed to be preparing for. All he could think about was Jorge. The man he'd passed 100 times in the hallways without more than a polite nod. The same man who had just revealed, almost by accident, a mind that could thread together 9 languages like threads in a tapestry. By 10 a.m., David was in the break room, pouring a second cup of coffee he didn't really need. He spotted Jorge wheeling his cart into the hallway nearby. With an impulsiveness he didn't often indulge, David called out, "Hey, Jorge, got a minute?" Jorge looked up, surprised. "Of course, sir. Everything all right?" David smiled and lifted his coffee. "I figured I owe you one. Care to join me?" Jorge hesitated, glancing at his cart, then nodded and followed David into the break room. He looked awkward in the space, his uniform, slightly worn at the cuffs, a stark contrast to the polished suits that usually filled the room. They sat at a corner table by the window. David passed him a cup of black coffee, which Jorge accepted with a quiet thank you. "So," David began, leaning forward, "a linguistics professor?" Jorge chuckled softly, a sound both proud and regretful. "Yes. Back in Honduras. I specialized in comparative linguistics. My focus was language evolution and phonetic convergence." David blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "That sounds far beyond what I studied in college." "I loved it," Jorge said, swirling his coffee gently. "Language is history, culture, connection. When you understand someone's language, you understand a part of their soul." There was a pause as that line hung in the air. David nodded, quietly moved. "What happened?" he asked. Jorge looked out the window for a long moment, his eyes tracing the clouds. The political climate changed. Universities were targeted. Free speech became dangerous. My wife and I knew we had to leave. We came here with our son, he was 5 at the time. I brought some books, my degrees, letters of recommendation. But they didn't matter. No one would recognize my credentials. The system, it wasn't built for people like me to start over so easily. David listened without interrupting, watching the man in front of him with a growing sense of discomfort, realizing how many people he'd looked past simply because they weren't in a boardroom or on a resume. "I worked construction, delivered food, then landed this job through a friend of a friend," Jorge continued. "The hours were steady. Night shifts meant I could help my son with homework during the day. He's in college now, on scholarship. Wants to be a teacher. Says he got it from me." David smiled, but Jorge didn't see it. His eyes were still distant, reflective. "I don't regret taking this job," Jorge added after a beat. "Work is dignity. It's feeding your family, even if no one sees what you gave up to do it. I clean floors. I mop hallways. But sometimes I dream in languages I haven't spoken in years." The company's main conference room was rarely silent. Usually, it buzzed with confident voices and the soft clatter of laptops opening, pens clicking, coffee cups settling onto coasters. But this morning, it was different. The long oak table stretched in front of a dozen department heads and mid-level managers, all murmuring in confusion, unsure why the CEO had called a full staff meeting on such short notice, and with no agenda. David Langston stood near the window, arms crossed, staring out over the skyline. He looked more thoughtful than usual, more deliberate. When he finally turned around, the room fell quiet instantly. The air thickened with curiosity. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice steady but serious. "I know this was unexpected." He paused, as if choosing his next words with care. "We talk a lot in this company about innovation," he continued. "About leadership. About how we want to be a global force that embraces diversity, talent, and ideas from everywhere. But sometimes, in chasing what's next, we miss what's right in front of us." People exchanged glances. A few leaned forward. David took a breath. "Last week, I met someone many of you have passed in the hallway without noticing. Someone who's been in this building longer than some of our executives. He's been here every night, making sure this space is spotless while we sleep. Most of us know him by name, but not by story." He stepped aside and motioned toward the door. It opened slowly. Jorge entered, wearing his janitor uniform. His hands were clean but worn, the lines in his face deep but kind. He walked with hesitation, eyes scanning the room as if unsure he was really supposed to be there. Murmurs rippled through the staff. A few eyebrows lifted. One of the HR managers looked visibly confused. David gestured to the head of the table. "Jorge, would you join me?" Jorge stepped forward. The silence grew almost reverent. "This is Jorge Ramirez," David said, resting a hand on the man's shoulder. "He speaks 9 languages. Not conversationally. Fluently. He's a trained linguist and was a professor before he was forced to flee his home country. He took a job here, not because it matched his talents, but because it allowed him to survive. To support his son. To start over." Several mouths fell open. A few lowered their eyes in quiet embarrassment. David continued, "We pride ourselves on finding talent around the world, yet we missed the talent that's been quietly cleaning our offices for 5 years. Until now." He turned to Jorge, who was visibly overwhelmed, blinking rapidly. "Jorge has agreed to take on a new position with us, as Director of Global Communication Training. Effective immediately." A beat of stunned silence. Then someone at the far end of the table began to clap. Another joined. And another. Until the room swelled with applause, not polite or performative, but rising like a wave of overdue recognition. Jorge opened his mouth to speak, then stopped. His voice caught. He pressed a hand to his chest, trying to find the words. In the weeks that followed the announcement, something in the company began to shift, quietly at first, like the turning of a tide you don't notice until you're standing in deeper water. Jorge Ramirez's story spread through the hallways faster than any memo or press release ever had. People who had never given the janitor a second glance were now stopping him in the corridors, not out of pity, but admiration. Jorge, always humble, responded with a small smile and a nod, never letting the attention change the way he moved through the building, still early, still tidy, still quiet. The only difference was that now, he carried a laptop instead of a mop bucket. Virionteca's global communication training program was Jorge's first initiative. With a curriculum built around cultural understanding, language accessibility, and interpersonal fluency, he led sessions that filled faster than the company could schedule them. What started as a soft skills workshop turned into a company-wide transformation. Remote teams from Germany, Brazil, South Korea, and Kenya suddenly found themselves better understood, better heard, and more included. Miscommunications that once dragged on projects began to vanish. Internal surveys showed a sharp rise in employee engagement and trust, especially among international hires who now felt, perhaps for the first time, that their voices mattered. The ripple effect didn't stop there. In HR meetings, managers began asking different questions during interviews, not just about degrees or job history, but about journeys, backgrounds, and hidden skills. The company launched a pilot program called Hidden Voices, designed to uncover talents in the most unexpected places. It started with an internal call, "Tell us what you love, what you've done, and what you never thought would matter here." Resumes poured in, from cafeteria staff with backgrounds in accounting, to security guards who were former software developers in their home countries. One maintenance worker, a soft-spoken man named Khalid, turned out to be a certified cybersecurity analyst who had fled civil unrest in Syria. 2 months later, he was offered a mentorship in the IT department. A receptionist with a background in fashion design was tapped to lead a visual rebranding project. A customer service agent turned out to be a published poet in 3 languages. Her writing now appeared in Virionteca's internal newsletters and public campaigns. The company's culture shifted, subtly but deeply. Conversations in elevators became warmer. Managers listened more. Employees from all levels began greeting each other by name, pausing long enough to really see the person behind the badge. Even turnover decreased. People weren't just working for a paycheck anymore, they were working for each other. Jorge's own life changed, too. With his new role came better hours, a livable salary, and the chance to travel again, this time by invitation, not desperation. He was invited to speak at conferences, universities, and even virtual panels where he addressed audiences in their native tongues, drawing gasps when he moved seamlessly from English to Korean to Swahili. His son, Mateo, graduated from college that spring, with honors. At the graduation ceremony, he brought Jorge on stage and introduced him not as a janitor, but as the man who taught him what dignity truly meant. Jorge never stopped cleaning up, though, not entirely. He'd still pick up trash left on counters or straighten crooked chairs after a meeting. Not because it was expected, but because it was who he was. And in that, others found a different kind of leadership, one rooted not in titles or power, but in quiet pride, in service, in grace. The holiday party sparkled with soft lights and warmth, a welcome contrast to the frigid December wind outside. The Virion headquarters had been transformed for the evening. The conference center was filled with tables draped in deep blue and silver linens, soft jazz played from a live quartet, and the scent of spiced cider and cinnamon hung in the air. Employees laughed over finger foods, exchanged gifts from the annual Secret Santa swap, and paused at the photo booth for silly snapshots in elf hats and tinsel. But beneath all the seasonal cheer, there was something else in the air, something quieter and more powerful. It had been a year since that unforgettable morning when the CEO had introduced Jorge Ramirez to the company not as a janitor, but as a leader. Tonight, Jorge stood near the back of the room, watching it all unfold with a sense of quiet awe. He wore a navy blue blazer, slightly oversized, a gift from his son. A small pin with the Virion logo was tucked into the lapel. His hands, though still calloused from years of labor, no longer gripped mops or buckets. These days, they held markers at whiteboards and notes for presentations. But tonight, they were empty, except for a cup of apple cider. Mr. Ramirez, a young intern called as she approached him with a beaming smile, "Your workshop on language bias completely changed how I think." "Thank you." Jorge nodded with a warm smile, thanking her, humbled by how often he was now approached by people who once walked past him without notice. The ripple continued, even now. David Langston took the stage a few minutes later, tapping the mic gently. The room hushed. "Before we all dive into dessert," he began with a grin, "I'd like to take a moment to reflect." He paused, letting the moment settle. This has been one of the most meaningful years in Virion history. Not because of record-breaking numbers, though we did hit a few milestones, he added with a chuckle, prompting light applause, but because we started to see each other. Really see each other. He looked across the crowd, then turned slightly toward the back of the room. "I want to invite someone up here. Someone who's taught us what leadership looks like when it doesn't wear a suit or carry a title. Someone who reminded us that brilliance doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes, it mops floors at midnight." There were a few knowing smiles, then a round of applause that grew as David extended a hand. Jorge hesitated only a second before making his way to the stage. As he walked through the rows of clapping colleagues, his heart pounded, not with nerves, but with something older and deeper. Pride, maybe. Or gratitude. When he reached the podium, David gave his shoulder a firm squeeze and stepped back. Jorge took a moment, surveying the room. Hundreds of faces looked back at him. Some smiling, some emotional. Many who, a year ago, might not have known his name. He exhaled slowly. "Good evening," he began, his accent still gentle, his tone steady. "I'm not used to microphones. Or stages. For a long time, the only sound I made in this building was the squeak of a mop bucket." A soft wave of laughter rolled through the crowd. "I came here with a backpack, a 5-year-old boy, and a heart full of fear. I had lost my home. My work. My title. In the first few months, I wondered if I would ever feel like more than a shadow." He paused, searching for words. But then something changed. Someone listened. Someone saw me. The room fell still. Jorge swallowed. "I spent 5 years cleaning these floors, and I did it with dignity, because I believe all work has value. But when someone takes the time to ask your story, to believe you have more to offer, it changes everything. Not just for you, but for everyone watching." He looked toward the front table, where Mateo sat, eyes glistening, hands clasped in pride. "My son is graduating next year. He wants to teach." And every time I see him help someone or speak up in class, I know the sacrifice was worth it. Jorge's voice trembled, but he didn't stop. I walk through these halls differently now. Not because of a title or paycheck, but because I'm no longer invisible. And that, to me, is the greatest gift. The applause began slowly, with a few people rising to their feet. Then more. Then all. The standing ovation surged like a wave, loud and long, echoing off the walls of the transformed conference room. Jorge stepped back, eyes shimmering, chest rising with a deep breath. Mateo joined him on stage, arms wrapping around his father in a fierce, proud hug. David watched from a few feet away, arms crossed, smiling not like a CEO admiring his company's success, but like a man who had witnessed something rare and deeply human.